Hello everyone, welcome to our third EU Cross webinar. I'm Andrione-Moylan from the Leuven Centre for Global Governance Studies at KU Leuven, and I will be moderating this webinar on sustainability, common concern and public goods with Professor Leal-Arcas, who is a member of the EU Cross network, and Dr. Axel Marx from the University of Leuven. Professor Rafael Leal-Arcas is holder of the first Jean Monnet Chair in EU International Economic Law, awarded in the UK by the European Commission at Queen Mary University of London, where he is Director of Research at the Centre for Commercial Law Studies. He teaches and is convener of the courses in International Economic Law, Trade, Climate Change and Energy, International Trade and Investment Law of the EU, as well as External Relations of the EU, in the LLM program. He is co-author of an upcoming paper in the Connecticut Journal of International Law entitled Towards a Carbon-Free, Decentralized and Democratized System of Energy Generation. Dr. Axel Marx is Deputy Director of the Leuven Centre for Global Governance Studies at the University of Leuven. He recently co-edited books on global governance of labour rights, global governance through trade, and edited a research collection on global governance. His research interests include voluntary sustainability standards, sustainable development, human rights, global governance, governance through trade, EU trade policy, and comparative case methods. So we're very glad to welcome you both to the EU Cross webinar series. EU Cross is a Jean Monnet network co-founded by the Erasmus Plus program of the European Union, entitled The European Union at the Crossroads of Global Order. It investigates the challenges and opportunities that the European Union and its main international partners face as our conventional understanding of the global order is put into question and multilateralism is contested. So I think today's webinar, which puts forward citizen participation in helping achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, will provide us with a very interesting perspective on dealing with global challenges. Finally, before we go ahead with our webinar, the structure of the discussion is as follows. First, Rafael will present for about 25 minutes. Then Axel will share his reflections with us, and Rafael will have the opportunity to reply. During both the presentations, you may send your questions to me via the webinar chat box, which you can access from the control panel, where you can also find and download today's presentation. After the discussion, I will bring your thoughts and questions into the debate and allow both Rafael and Axel to respond. It's my pleasure now to give the floor to Rafael, and I very much look forward to his presentation. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Alex, for this introduction and this opportunity to present what you see here as the title, A New Governance for Sustainable Development. So the whole idea here is looking at trade as part of the solution to climate change mitigation or environmental protection instead of part of the problem. In other words, the presentation that I'm going to do now in the next 25 minutes is about the governance of sustainable development from the perspective of the international trading system. So with that in mind, let me then give you very quickly an outline of my presentation. My first point is my thesis, which is that the trading system is actually a very powerful tool for change, and more specifically when it comes to environmental protection. The second point of my presentation is that there is insufficient cooperation between two different but related epistemic communities, namely the trading system on the one hand and climate change on the other. And it is actually very important for these two communities to work with each other much more closely for the benefit of sustainable development. My third point will be a textual analysis of 14 recent free trade agreements that incorporate sustainable development chapters and how these can be utilized as legal instruments to mitigate climate change much more effectively than is the case today. Fourth will be possible solutions as I see them. Then I will conclude, and if we have some time within this 25 minutes, what I think is the way forward. So this is the outline of my presentation. Let me then start with my thesis, which is that the trading system is a very powerful instrument for change. And let me give you 2 examples based on empirical evidence where this has been the case. The first is poverty reduction. According to the World Bank, over 1 billion people have come out of poverty between 1990 and 2010. This is absolutely great news for humanity. And the country that has benefited the most has been China, where 400 million people have come out of poverty. Again, thanks to the trading system, we have managed to reduce poverty. A second example that I want to share with you where the trading system has been a very powerful instrument for change has been the protection of human rights, and more specifically, labor rights. Today, about 75% of countries use free trade agreements for the protection of human rights, as I said, more specifically, labor rights. And so then the question is, why not use the trading system as a novel tool for the biggest challenge that humanity faces today, namely the mitigation of climate change? To contextualize what I'm trying to say, let me say that between 80 and 90% of global energy supply today comes from fossil fuels, according to the International Energy Agency as of 2013. And as we know, fossil fuels have problems. One is that they produce carbon dioxide and therefore contribute to climate change, but they are also finite and not evenly distributed, which leads to a situation of energy insecurity, in that most countries of the world depend on very few countries in the world that actually have those fossil fuels. So what I propose is that we move from fossil fuels to renewable energy, because it is cleaner than fossil fuels and therefore protects the environment, but also it helps towards energy independence and therefore enhances energy security. And my premise here is that the trading system can be utilized as a vehicle to get from fossil fuels to renewable energy, which is what I'm trying to say in this presentation. That therefore raises the question whether trade agreements can actually be a solution to decarbonization, which, as I said before, is the biggest challenge humanity faces today. And to answer this question, I'm going to bring forward 2 legal instruments as potential solution. One is environmental agreements, but the problem with these international environmental agreements is that they have not produced strong results so far, and enforcement is an issue in that environmental agreements have no teeth when it comes to dispute settlement. Unlike trade agreements, which is the second legal instrument that I propose here, which are enforceable, and we see that increasingly they include chapters that deal with sustainable development. That raises a very interesting question, namely whether trade agreements are more effective than climate change agreements for the mitigation of climate change. And this seems to me to be a counterintuitive question, because who would have thought that a trade agreement is actually a more effective legal instrument than an environmental agreement when it comes to the mitigation of climate change, because precisely trade agreements, unlike environmental agreements, are enforceable. So my point of departure is that we stand to achieve considerable gains when the trading system becomes a tool for change. And I gave you a few examples where this has been the case in the past. My hypothesis is that the trading system, and more specifically trade law, can be a tool to help mitigate climate change, but also enhance access to energy. We can do this by reducing barriers to trading green goods and services. Think, for example, of giving preferential treatment to electric vehicles as opposed to fossil fuel-based vehicles. That would be a way for the trading system to help mitigate climate change in a more effective manner. If suddenly many countries of the world decided to change from fossil fuel-based cars or vehicles at large to electric vehicles, that would be a very effective, simple way from a policy point of view to mitigate climate change. Or also solar panels. So what I want to show you here is that the idea is to fill the theoretical and empirical gap for how the trading system, and more specifically trade law, can help mitigate climate change. So I have come up with a theory that I call the triple benefit of trade, which you can see on the right side of the screen. And the idea is that the trading system can actually help mitigate climate change. It can also have or enhance access to clean energy, and thanks to the trading system, we can continue to grow macroeconomically. Hence the triple benefit of trade. In other words, thanks to trade, we can potentially mitigate climate change, we can have greater access to clean energy, and we can continue to grow macroeconomically. That brings me to the second point of my presentation, which is that we need to move from insufficient cooperation to effective synergies between trade and climate change. And let me explain what I mean here, because I think this is important to understand what I'm trying to convey. There are a few missed opportunities that have taken place since the 1990s. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was created in 1992, where it was agreed that climate change is anthropogenic, and it was therefore the creation of the first legal instrument to help mitigate climate change. 2 years later, we had another international agreement called the World Trade Organization Agreement. So this one was on international trade. And the only thing it says when it comes to sustainable development, and by the way, in the preamble, is that sustainable development is important in the context of international trade. But that's all it says. So I would argue that this is the first missed opportunity for the trading system to have greater cooperation with climate change. Fast forward a few more years, around 2006, 2008, we have the so-called 21st century trade agreements, but with weak chapters that deal with sustainable development. Again, another missed opportunity for the trading system to have better cooperation with climate change. If you fast forward a few more years, by 2015, we had the famous Paris Agreement on climate change. And this time around, it doesn't even mention the concept of trade. So again, a missed opportunity for the climate regime to cooperate in a more meaningful manner with the trading system. So the question is, how can these two regimes, both trade and climate change, help or cooperate for the benefit of sustainable development and more specifically, access to clean energy, as well as the mitigation of climate change? So my vision is that we can actually use the trading system as a vehicle, not only to have access to renewable energy and climate action, but I would argue the remaining 15 sustainable development goals that you have in the bottom of the screen. If you look at what is happening in the international trading system, you can see here that since the early 90s, the rise of completion of regional trade agreements is obvious. Certainly since year 2000, you can see that the number of regional trade agreements being concluded is clearly on the rise, both when it comes to trading goods and trading services. It's also interesting to see that the number of environmental provisions per regional trade agreement has also gone up since the beginning of the mid-90s and certainly the end of the 2000s, so 2007, 2008, we can see an incremental rise in the number of environmental provisions that are part of regional trade agreements. And so what we've done, and this brings me now to my third point, is a textual analysis of trade agreements that have wording that is relevant to environmental protection. And so we have divided the 14 trade agreements that you can see here into three groups. The first, US trade agreements with Korea, Colombia, Peru, the Trans-Pacific Partnership before the United States withdrew from that agreement and the recent agreement called United States, Mexico, Canada. A second type of trade agreements is the EU trade agreements with Japan, Singapore, Ukraine, Korea, Colombia, Peru, and the comprehensive economic trade agreement that the EU has with Canada. And then the third category of trade agreements with environmental protection provisions are those that we call other trade agreements. So the EU-US trade agreement currently being negotiated, the famous Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, as well as ASEAN agreements, both with China and India. I should argue here, I should say that all these 14 free trade agreements have been chosen either because they include major emitters of greenhouse gases or because they have wording that is relevant to sustainable development. Now, empirically, you can see that the number of climate-related provisions in free trade agreements is, in the case of the EU, the region of the world that leads in the number of trade agreements that have provisions related to either environmental protection or climate change. So the darker the color, the higher the number of provisions that are related to climate change. And you can see from this graph that it is actually the European Union that leads the number of free trade agreements that have provisions for environmental protection. So one would think, by looking at this map, that therefore the European free trade agreements would be the best. However, based on our empirical analysis, we were actually quite surprised that that is not the case. So here's what we did. We looked into two parameters for the analysis of the 14 free trade agreements that I mentioned before. The first one being substantive content, which could be weak, ambiguous, or solid when it comes to the protection of the environment. And the second parameter, enforceability. Either these provisions that deal with environmental protection are enforceable or non-enforceable. And so as a result of these two parameters, we came up with 5 possible configurations. The first one is one where there is enforceability, but the content is weak. The second configuration is a situation where there is enforceability of that environmental relevant provision, but the content is ambiguous. The third configuration is one where the content is ambiguous, but there is no enforceability. A fourth possible configuration, one where the content is solid, but again, no enforceability. And the last and best configuration is one where the content is solid when it comes to the protection of the environment and there is enforceability. However, the scope of that enforceability is restrictive. And so here you can see graphically the outcome of our empirical analysis, enforceability versus content. And you can see that all the agreements in the top arrow are actually enforceable. And therefore, I would argue the most effective free trade agreements when it comes to the protection of the environment. Interestingly, if you look at the top right side of this slide, they are all US free trade agreements. So more specifically, US with Korea, Peru, Colombia, and the most recent US FTA, the famous United States, Mexico, Canada agreement. So all these agreements are enforceable and the content when it comes to environmental protection is solid. So from that point of view, we argue that these are, to our surprise actually, the best free trade agreements when it comes to the protection of the environment. I should argue also and say very clearly that although they are enforceable, they have a rather restrictive scope. Now, if you look at the ones at the bottom, they happen to be EU free trade agreements. Not a single one of them offers enforceability. So we argue from that point of view that European free trade agreements are not as effective as American FTAs when it comes to environmental protection. If you look at the bottom right side, you see that the EU-Singapore FTA is an example of a free trade agreement where the content is solid. However, there is no enforceability, and therefore we argue it is not as effective as American FTAs when it comes to environmental protection. This brings me to what we propose might be a possible solution moving forward, which is the inclusion of adequate language in free trade agreements. And so I'll give you an example from Article 12, Paragraph 6 of Paragraph 2 of the EU-Singapore FTA, which says, and I quote, "The parties shall effectively implement the multilateral environmental agreements to which they are party," end of quote. So if you look at this text, you can see that when it comes to the content, it is actually a very strong case being made both by Singaporeans and Europeans for the protection of the environment. But the problem is enforceability, in that the first thing it says in that EU-Singapore FTA, when you go to the dispute settlement chapter, is the fact that the environmental protection chapter is not covered by the dispute settlement chapter. So what we propose is that the relevant provision needs to be covered by the dispute settlement chapter of the relevant agreement. So the argument here is that quantity does not actually correlate with quality or enforceability, in that European free trade agreements actually have the largest number of provisions that deal with environmental protection. However, there is no enforceability, and therefore we argue that is a deficiency. That therefore brings me to my fourth point, which is what are the possible solutions moving forward? One is multilateralism, but as we know, it is in decline, certainly in the case of international trade. If we see what is happening these days in the context of the WTO dispute settlement system, more specifically the appellate body, I would argue multilateralism is not at its best when it comes to trade. The same is true in energy. There is no global energy governance. And so perhaps one could argue that multilateralism is really not the best solution moving forward, at least at the moment. A second possible solution is plurilateralism, which is something to be explored, specifically through the so-called climate clubs. This is an idea of putting together the major emitters of greenhouse gases in order to effectively or more effectively mitigate climate change, for example, through the promotion of technology transfer among the various parties to these plurilateral agreements. A third possible solution is regionalism, which, as I said before a few minutes ago in my presentation, it is on the rise. There are so many countries concluding regional trade agreements throughout the world, so that's possibly one way forward. Another possible solution is bilateralism, which was actually quite effective under the previous US administration in what I call the G2, US-China bilateral agreement. And I think this is relevant because these two countries are by far the major emitters of greenhouse gases. China is responsible for 29% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and the United States is responsible for 16% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So it's actually very important for these two countries to have better cooperation for the benefit of climate change mitigation. Another possible solution is unilateralism, which has been unsuccessfully used by the Europeans in the past. Here is where the Europeans thought that if we cannot solve the problem of climate change multilaterally, then we will try to do so unilaterally. And so they decided to go sector specific, here more specifically dealing with aviation, and the idea of the Europeans was the inclusion of aviation in the emissions trading system, which didn't happen globally because every country and every airline in the world opposed the idea of including aviation in the emissions trading scheme. But I have to say, the good news is that now there is aviation in the inclusion of emissions trading systems for intra-EU aviation. And the final possible solution is what I call not only these intergovernmental, so horizontal approaches to mitigating climate change, but vertical approaches. By that I mean mayors in different cities of the world, NGOs, governors in different regions of the world, universities, companies are doing very much for the implementation of the Paris Agreement, and therefore it is not a horizontal but rather a vertical approach when it comes to the implementation of the Paris Agreement. Here you can see graphically an example of what I mean by plurilateralism. This is the Major Economies Forum on Energy and Climate, which is 16 countries plus the European Union. So those countries in green are the members of the Major Economies Forum. And I call this the 80-80-60. By that I mean that these 17 entities are responsible for 80% of global greenhouse gas emissions, 80% of the GDP of the world, and 60% of the population of the world. So there is a lot of legitimacy in this platform, even if it is only 17 entities at the moment. And then you could think that gradually and incrementally other countries may join moving forward. When it comes to regionalism, here's an example where we could actually merge the trading system with the climate change regime. And my argument here is that the only thing we need in the absence of a global agreement that is legally binding for mitigating climate change is putting together just a few major emitters of greenhouse gases and only 3 mega regional trade agreements, and that would be enough to make a great contribution towards climate change mitigation and access to clean energy. The 3 mega-RTAs or regional trade agreements that I have in mind are the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which is the countries in brown, so the US and the EU, which is an agreement that has been negotiated for quite a few years now. It was stopped, but it has been resumed in April 2019. A second mega regional trade agreement is the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. These are 11 countries in the Asia-Pacific region, which are the ones that appear in green. And the third mega regional trade agreement that many people don't talk about, certainly in the West, but I think could be potentially a very interesting platform for enhancing access to energy as well as mitigating climate change through the trading system, is the so-called Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is the countries that you see in blue. Some of them are also in green because they happen to be parties to both regional trade agreements. So these are the 10 countries of ASEAN in Southeast Asia, plus 6 countries, which are China, Japan, Korea, India, Australia, and New Zealand. So the point here is that we only need 3 mega regional trade agreements that are legally binding and the major emitters of greenhouse gases to make sure that we can effectively and much more rapidly mitigate climate change and continue to grow macroeconomically. Graphically, you can see here that you don't need the whole world, although obviously that would be desirable, but it suffices to have the major emitters, which are, as you can see, the United States, Europe at large, not just the European Union, China, and Japan. In this graph, you can see that the United States, Japan, and Europe are the main importers of trade-related emissions, whereas China is by far the main exporter of emissions of greenhouse gases related to trade. Again, in the absence of a global agreement that is legally binding, one could start from the bottom up in an incremental and progressive system by having the major emitters, who incidentally are the major economies of the world, making sure that they cooperate with each other and that are legally binding for the emissions of greenhouse gases. So just to conclude, So far, we see that there is limited input of trade agreements to climate change mitigation. When it comes to enforcement, we have seen that not a single EU free trade agreement offers enforceability for climate change relevant provisions, whereas all the US FTAs do. However, when it comes to substantive content, where there is solid content, there is either no enforceability, which is the case of the EU-Singapore Free Trade Agreement, or restrictive scope blocks the potential of enforcement, which, as I said before, is the case of US FTAs. The second point I want to make is that many trade agreements and trade rules that we have today were designed in the 20th century, where there was obviously very limited mention of climate change, and that was due to the fact that the science of climate change was rather weak. But that is not the case today. The science of climate change is much more robust than ever, and therefore future free trade agreements or trade agreements at large should address the 21st century challenges, such as having access to clean energy and finding ways to mitigate climate change. So what we need is much greater dialogue between trade and climate change, as well as access to sustainable energy. I think I am beyond my time, so I'm going to skip this final point on the way forward, but I'm happy to mention what I think could be the way forward in an effective manner. And let me then conclude by showing a few books that may help you if you're interested in reading further about what I just presented. The first one on the left is a book that has just been published called Solutions for Sustainability: How the International Trade, Energy and Climate Change Regimes Can Help. The next one is the first research handbook on EU energy law and policy that I co-edited with a professor at the University of Leuven, Professor Jan Wouters. The third one is titled University Initiatives in Climate Change Mitigation and Adaptation that I co-edited with Professor Walter Leal. The next one is the first commentary on the Energy Charter Treaty that I edited and published in 2018. I also published a book in 2016 titled Energy Security, Trade and the EU, Regional and International Perspectives. Then in 2013, the first ever book on the links between climate change and international trade that I authored. And then the final one that I want to share with you is a book that I co-authored titled International Energy Governance, Selected Legal Issues, that was published in 2014. With that, I thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to questions you may have. Over to you, Alex.
Excellent, Rafael. Thank you. Thank you very much for this rich presentation. I think there's a lot of food for thought, as you say. I would now ask Axel Marx to join us and share with us his thoughts. And I also remind our audience that they may start sending me their questions so that I can then share them during our Q&A session. Axel, you have the floor.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you very much, Rafael, for a very interesting and rich presentation, and also for sending along a very interesting paper on sustainability, common concern, and public goods. Actually, in the paper, you contextualize much more what you discussed today, and you provide a very rich and well-documented paper, which gives a lot of food of thoughts and has a lot of, let's say, interesting ideas. So my comments will be both on the presentation you did, which is a sub-part of the paper, and some of the issues you raised in the paper, which you send along with this seminar. And although your paper and also the presentation is full of facts and a lot of these relevant references and also ideas, I also think that in a way the paper is a bit normatively. in terms of what you really think should happen to achieve greater sustainability. So you bring in a lot of proposals on what ought to be and what should happen. And actually the red line through all my comments is a bit related to that, in terms of what does deepen a bit the proposals you make, and also sometimes question a bit whether the proposals you make will really work, but it's just to feed the discussion and to think a bit further on that. At the end of one of your slides, you showed a lot of initiatives which can be taken to address climate change. And that's where my first comment comes from. So you have these clubs, you have trade agreements, but on the bottom of the slide, you also focused a lot on, let's say, the vertical approaches. You look at cities, NGOs, companies, universities, and so on. And I agree, they take a lot of initiatives and they do a lot of initiatives, but isn't there a risk when you look at all these possible solutions that you just have too many different initiatives working along each other, which might not necessarily complement one another, but hollow out what some initiatives try to do, and that you actually create competition between many different types of initiatives which want to, in essence, achieve the same goal. And my first question is, how do you see this evolving, and how do you think you can create mechanisms which would better coordinate and orchestrate between these different types of initiatives? Because we run the risk that we have many different parallel types of initiatives, but without much coordination, they might only operate suboptimal. That's the first point. A second point is related to what's more in the paper, which came a little bit less out of the presentation, but which is very strong in the paper, is that you have a very strong belief on empowering citizens to achieve sustainability. And in a way, you assume that empowering citizens is always good in a way. And that's, let's say, something which I think might be questioned or debated. You write in the paper that citizens' empowerment can be achieved by allowing for more participation in the process of the decision-making in relation to climate change and sustainability. But there's the question, what if most citizens are not interested in sustainability or environmental protection? What if most citizens do not want an energy transition because it just might be too costly? So it might actually be that empowering citizens, although from a democratic point of view, it's very much defendable, that from an efficiency point of view, it might be suboptimal. To give you an example, in quite a few European countries, there's quite a bit of debate that in some cases citizens just have too many participation rights in achieving certain, for instance, infrastructure works. They block infrastructure works which might contribute towards the transition to a more clean energy system. So on the one hand, I see where you come from with empowering citizens, but on the other hand, we might also question to a degree whether the trust we put in citizens is well warranted. In another part of the paper, and that relates more directly to trade, you have a bit of a same assumption when you look at the power of consumers to buy environmental goods. And there also the question is whether consumer power for sustainability is really a big driving force. There is evidence, and you're right, that in Europe and US, you have consumers buying and making buying decisions based on environmental qualities of products, how they were made, and so on. But we also see that the demand is a bit stagnating. And the big question is, of course, what is this demand in emerging economies like Brazil, China, India, and so on? And can we really put trust on empowering consumers to create a transition towards more sustainability? Then more specifically, in relation to trade agreements, you also see some role for citizens in order to have, let's say, a role to play in in making trade agreements more sustainable, but there it's the question of how can this be achieved and what would be the precise role of citizens in develop or in the execution of trade agreements. Then final set of comments more related specifically to your presentation now and also to parts in the paper. In a way, I feel a bit of a tension in your paper, and the tension is as follows. You start a presentation with starting with the observation that trade can be an instrument for change. And then you analyze how current trade instruments deal with environmental protection and deal with climate change. And you know that specifically the European approach is a bit weak on its design, both in substantive provisions as well as in procedures. And then you make some kind of a jump towards thinking, well, we can improve the current approach by making it more effective, by having stronger substantive provisions, by having stronger enforceability. And I think for part of the argument is based on what you said in the beginning of the presentation, namely that trade has been an instrument for change, for instance, in poverty reduction and in the protection of labor rights. But if you look at the protection of labor rights through trade agreements, they actually have been criticized for the same deficiencies as you point out in your paper, namely that the substantive provisions are unclear. They all make a reference to the ILO declaration, but they don't go much in detail on which rights should be protected and in what way. They have been criticized to have very weak enforceability mechanisms, both in terms of how the compliance with the labor rights in the trade agreement are monitored. There is a specific monitoring mechanism in the trade agreement which revolves around domestic advisory groups, but they have been criticized to be very weak. And they have been criticized for the lack of any possibility to really foster compliance with these labor rights or have some kind of an effective sanction if there is non-compliance with labor rights. And that parallels a lot of the analysis you did with climate change. And the question there is, can we really improve the current approach towards protecting labor rights and environmental protection in trade agreements? Or maybe, but that's of course a point of discussion, maybe we should not further proceed this route of combining achieving trade objectives and non-trade objectives via trade agreements. There's only so much you can do with a trade agreement, and maybe it's better to concentrate on having, let's say, the trade benefits and outcomes of a trade agreement, and do not create some kind of an expectation that we can also address many other issues like climate change or like labor rights protection to trade agreements. We can mention them in trade agreements, and we can, to a certain degree, raise awareness about them through trade agreements, but we will never be able, I think, to really address labor rights or climate change issues purely to trade agreements. So that's a bit of the question of what do we need to choose. And then a point I wanted to raise, and I think you make very interesting proposals in the paper on trade agreements. And one thing I maybe just want to hear your thoughts about or your ideas about is one thing which was not discussed, I think, is one way we could use trade agreements to foster more environmental protection is to use the tariff mechanism. And for instance, have much reduced tariffs on environmental goods, on clean technologies and these types of things, and have far higher tariffs on polluting goods. Do you think that would be a good way forward? And do you think that would be you would be able to make a difference in that way? So these were some of my thoughts and comments when I read your paper and heard your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Axel. Should I address the questions now?
Yeah, Rafael, you may, I would say a fairly concise reply, and then we have a couple of questions from our audience with which we can bring our webinar to a close. But please go ahead.
Okay, so then let me then start by thanking Axel for very thoughtful points made. There are quite a few of them, so what I'll do is I'll try to address them in the order I have received them. There was one about the various solutions that I proposed, and one of them was vertical approaches to the mitigation of climate change, where Axel, you were asking me whether there are too many actors involved here and whether that could be a problem. Well, my initial reaction would be that the more, the better. I think this is not something that should be exclusively from a top-down. Rather, I would argue, in addition, also a bottom-up approach to the mitigation of climate change. What we are seeing is that mayors in different cities of the world are working together to help each other. Say, for example, the mayor of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil with the mayor of Manila in the Philippines may share best practices because what works in one jurisdiction could potentially be useful for another jurisdiction in another part of the world. So I think it's very good that mayors in different cities of the world are contributing. I'll give you another example. The mayor of Copenhagen is much more active when it comes to the mitigation of climate change than the Prime Minister of Denmark. So why should we think only from a top-down approach? Why not also bottom-up approach? And therefore, I welcome as many actors as possible when it comes to the mitigation of climate change and the implementation of the Paris Agreement. I would argue we need to try all of them. It doesn't have to be exclusive. Second point you made was on empowering citizens for sustainability. Here, again, I have a different take. I think we see in the case of energy that there is a clear bottom-up approach with the engagement of citizens, prosumers, so-called prosumers. These are consumers of energy who are also producers of energy and therefore prosumers of energy through smart grids is a case in point that is happening, not least in Belgium, one jurisdiction that I have been studying carefully. And we see that there is a rise of prosumers in Belgium. I gave the example of climate change, the implementation of Paris Agreement from the bottom up is another case in point for the empowerment of citizens when it comes to sustainability. Now, I believe that young people do care very much about sustainability. I'll give you 3 examples where this is the case. Famous Greta from Sweden, who is nominated to the Nobel Prize in Peace, is a case in point of a teenager, as young as a teenager, who is very much interested and very vocal when it comes to sustainability. Another example is that a few years ago, also a teenager in the United States brought a legal action against the US government because he was of the view that the US government at the federal level is not doing enough for climate change mitigation. And a third example, one in the Netherlands, where an NGO, Urgenda, actually brought a legal action against the government of the Netherlands. The case went up to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court of the Netherlands actually heard the case on the 24th of May 2019. And therefore, these are examples where there is evidence that people are interested, people are concerned more than ever about a sustainable future. Perhaps older people are less interested, but there is no doubt in my mind through empirical evidence that younger people do care about sustainability. A third point you made had to do with buying environmental goods and what will be the case for emerging economies. This is a good point that you're making. I would say that possible way forward are education, making sure that we educate people about the importance of investing in environmental goods. And obviously, I understand your point that green goods are more expensive. For example, an electric car is more expensive than a fossil fuel-based car. So we need to find economic incentives to make the transition towards clean energy. A fourth point you made was on the role of citizens in trade agreements. I agree with you that at the moment it remains rather intergovernmental, so at the diplomatic level. However, think of e-commerce. Here's an example where at the bottom-up level, at the subnational level, you can see that is happening already, the greater investment and role participation of citizens in trade agreements. And a final point you made, or a fifth point, was trade as an instrument for change, and the fact that the European Union is rather weak in the design of the procedures of these free trade agreements, where enforceability is a problem at the moment. And you're absolutely right that when it comes to labor rights, that is the same issue as environmental protection. So the whole issue of enforceability is a clear example of the difficulty for labor rights. But as I said at the beginning of my presentation, 75% of countries today use free trade agreements for the protection of labor rights, even if I agree with you, environment and enforceability remains an issue in labor rights. Now, I think your question was, can we improve the approach of climate change as is the case of labor rights? I think, again, my view, as I said in my presentation, is that the trading system can actually help, and it could be a very powerful instrument if we are able to give preferential treatment to environmental goods as opposed to non-environmental goods. So think, for example, of a jurisdiction like China, and suddenly through the trading system, we're able to change all the combustion-based vehicles, not only cars, but also buses and trucks, for clean electric vehicles. That would be a very effective way for China to very rapidly and aggressively mitigate climate change. So all the carbon dioxide emissions that would come from combustion-based vehicles wouldn't be the case anymore thanks to electric vehicles. And the last point you made had to do with the use of free trade agreements to foster environmental protection, whether we could do this through tariffs mechanism. Absolutely, I could not agree more. A case in point is the example I just gave. If the international trading system were to either put a tariff on dirty goods, if we can call it that way, or give preferential treatment to clean goods, in my view, that would be a very simple policy choice for effective mitigation of climate change. With that, I bring it back to Alex for other questions from the floor. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you very much, Rafael. Indeed, we have a few final questions from our audience. I think we will have only one round of questions, and then as we're running out of time. So first of all, we have Vinit Hegde, who questions whether we are not asking too much of free trade agreements. After all, the WTO is primarily an institution aimed at liberalization. Reform proposals in the area of sustainability, agriculture, and fishery subsidies have gone very slowly. What if we think of a cooperation between the WTO and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, therefore kind of playing off the strengths of these two institutions and keeping the balance between trade and sustainable development? Then we have a number of questions from Carrie Otterburn, who first of all asks whether, well, how do we deal with cases in which non-trade related chapters in free trade agreements lack enforcement or are violated whenever the trade-off between economic development to sustainability is kind of taken into account from that perspective. And related to this, of course, is then how do we deal with demands related to the right to development, and how do we address this vis-a-vis the needs of tackling sustainable development, of course, on the other hand, through, again, free trade agreements. And then we have two questions related to the role of citizens in free trade agreements and sustainability. And so we have, on the one hand, Piotr Svezo, who asks what your thoughts are on the global administrative law theory in explaining the role of citizens and consumers in dealing with climate change. And finally, on this topic, again from Carrie Otterburn, how do you see concretely the involvement of citizens? Partly you've answered this question, but perhaps you can elaborate on this, especially in the context of how referendums have come more to the fore, and so the role of direct democracy, which is highly contentious in terms of its whether it can actually have a positive impact, and also taking into account how bottom-up processes can be hijacked, but by those who have economic means to kind of shape the debate and the discussion on these kind of issues. The floor is yours, Rafael.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Alex, for sharing with me these 4 questions, if I understood correctly. So let me answer each one of them from in order in which I have received them. The first one from Vinite Hecte, the question whether there is too much asking now of the international trading system. Well, I would argue that today there is so much overlap among all these global concerns that it is not possible to think of the trading system in clinical isolation. That may have been the case, as I said, in the 20th century, when we did not know enough about the impact of climate change. Today, the science of climate change is much more robust than ever, and I think there is no excuse to isolate the trading system from the biggest challenge humanity faces today, which is climate change and mitigation. And therefore, I fully agree with Vinite that we need to find much more and more effective cooperation between the WTO and UNFCCC. The second question by Karen on non-trade chapters in free trade agreements that lack enforcement. That is precisely the point that I've been trying to discuss for the past 1 hour. And that is certainly the case of chapters that deal with sustainable development. So the solution moving forward, in my view, should be a better design of sustainable development chapters in free trade agreements, making sure that they are enforceable and making sure that these sustainable development chapters are actually serious about the mitigation of climate change and having access to clean energy. I said during my presentation that since 2006, 2008, we see this is the case, but if you read these sustainable development chapters, they remain very, very weak. So there's much more we can do for a better design of these sustainable development chapters in future free trade agreements. The third question from Piotr, if I understood correctly, on global administrative law theory. This is a very, very interesting question. And in fact, Dick Stewart at NYU Law School in Washington Square in New York and his team have been working for quite a few years now about global administrative law and the role that it can play in understanding common concerns, global issues, such as, for example, the one we're dealing with here, which is sustainable development. So I think it is a very important way forward as a good platform to look into the work done by Professor Stewart at NYU Law School on global administrative law. And the final question was on the role of referenda. in Western liberal democracies and what is the role of democracy at large in the discussion that we are presenting here, this bottom-up approach. Again, I go back to the example I gave before, where in my view, there is clear empirical evidence that people, especially young people, so the ones that are going to shape the future, really care about sustainability. I gave you the example of Greta, who has been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize as someone who has been incredibly vocal when it comes to doing much more of for the implementation of the Paris Agreement and climate change mitigation at large. Teenagers in different parts of the world are also very keen into bringing legal actions against government. So I think it is going to be a very positive impact to see the role of democracy in this debate, this bottom-up approach to the mitigation of climate change. Alex, over to you.
Thank you very much, Rafael. I think that is all the time that we have for today. So I would like to thank our speakers, Professor Rafael Leal-Arcas and Dr. Axel Marx, as well as our audience members, of course, for taking part in this EU Cross webinar. Our next EU Cross webinar will take place on the 20th of November with Professor Mathieu Bournet on the topic of Europe and the Eurasian Project, Fractured Borderlands. Please stay tuned for our updates on our website as well as on our Twitter account at EU Cross. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you will join us again next time. From Rafael, Axel, and myself, thank you and goodbye.